forum yesterday. It's nice to see you all here again. And for those of you who are new, it's a very open forum. There are a few moments to ask questions, to go through some things, and to ask some more personal questions. So for all of you, today is about an introduction to personal statements. Now, you may remember, or you may have seen previously, that this is a requirement for UCAS, for every university, but it's also a requirement for Oxbridge too as a result. And it's something that can really show off your personal abilities and your personal interests. It's kind of the part that sells you. So it's really super important. Alongside your aptitude tests and alongside your potential interview, it's really important, because this is how you secure the interview offer. It's this and your aptitude test. So, you know, what better way to follow yesterday than with this? So here is the Menti link. If you remember yesterday, it's the same thing. Please do join. It might make it easier so you can access the presentation directly. But I'll leave it up for a couple more seconds, just for those of you who want to grab that. Getting a lot of likes, so I'm going to leave it up for a couple more seconds. Okay, I'm going to move it on. So again, this is about your application journey, and a good way to do this is by thinking about my application journey. Now, I saw some of you last night and today had tagged this on LinkedIn, and it was good to see the engagement. It's really good to see the enthusiasm about your journey. So yeah, keep it up. So, I mean, what do you know about the personal statement? This is an opportunity for you guys to interact and to give a few different opinions. Unique. Super curriculars. It's a good word. Reading required for all unis. Yeah. A4 paper. That's a practical suggestion. That's good. Yeah. So we have a good summary here of, I think, what could be described as the core parts of a personal statement. So we're covering the necessary elements. So it is compulsory. It is required for all unis. But there are some elements in there to which you have more discretion, you know, showing off your passion, selling yourself, I suppose, and personality. Now, we're getting the word passionate coming up a lot. This is kind of like an insider secret, but it's important that you avoid using the word passionate, because if you're selling yourself, you need to sell yourself, and everyone's using passionate. So avoiding the word passion directly is just a little tip there, a kind of nugget of gold, if you will. So yeah, I think the selection here covers everything really well. It is about yourself, and it's about your academic focus. It's about the reading you've done. It's about demonstrating your talents. It's a great way to put it. Okay, cool. So here are some of the drier details, I suppose. You know, we have the 4,000 character limit. Now, this is important. 4,000 characters might seem like loads to some, but it's not. That's not 4,000 words. That's 4,000 characters. So the page of A4 comment is very apt here. It is no longer really than a page of A4, which is not a lot of room to show off who you are. As we said, it's a chance to show yourself off. And it's an important aspect of the application process for sure. So this is really a way to accumulate all of the different parts that make up you and make up the qualities that you've demonstrated thus far as a student. This is the opportunity to do that. Now, Yesterday, we spoke a little bit about a few things that might be important, some foundational concepts to aptitude tests. And structure came up when we were looking at the essays. And this is true of all of your written work. Structure is important. You'll know from college or sixth form that structure is something that every essay subject for humanities is really, really centered around. And so we need to make sure that we carry that over here. Now, we'll talk a little bit about this in a bit. For those of you that were here yesterday, and also for those of you that weren't, at the end, there is a kind of Q&A. And so if you have any questions, please jot them down and be prepared to ask them then. But this is the summary. Okay, great. So we have a kind of hands-on excerpt from an English personal statement here. Just take a minute to have a read over this before I start narrating, because that can be distracting. It's not, centrally important that you read the entire thing. If you're accessing the presentation in front of you, then it's easier to go through this. But what's important to note here are two things. The first thing you need to note is how the student has structured this. So how do they talk about things? In what order do they talk about things? When do they relate things, their personal experience, to their academic experience? So if we look at the coursework element, the comparison here is made between the two books that have been studied. But then afterwards, the student focuses on writing about the enjoyment that they've received from this and how this has pushed them academically. So ordering both the entire personal statement and your individual points is really, really crucial. Another thing to consider here, the second thing to consider, is how they discuss their experience. So it's not only about the structure, but it's about what you say afterwards. For example, after it discusses different books read, A Streetcar Named Desire, the play by Tennessee Williams, the student then talks about their experience and how that's pushed them to do things academically. It's encouraged them to watch A Cat on a Hot Tin Roof. So I think it's not just about the structure of the piece and the points, but also about the experiences that you draw from these things, how that's furthered your academic experience. Okay, so a few tips there. I think we'll move on. Great. So we have a question. We have a few people ready. Just wait for a few more people to collect. So this is an opportunity for you to provide some suggestions perhaps about, what would go in a personal statement more generally, and what you could see in that personal statement that you might want to change. It's not always obvious at first. So all of these answers have been marked incorrect, but there is no correct answer. So they're not necessarily wrong. And we have a few suggestions here, less listing, less personal, more achievement, remove passionate might be a good suggestion. Yeah, good spot. That's a personal mark from me. Not enough focus on supercurricular. Yeah, that's true. So it's not always that there is a one size fits all when it comes to personal statements. There is not a set of indicative requirements that will give you the best personal statement. But there are a few things you can do to kind of narrow down and guarantee that what you are writing is a good effort. So less listing has come up quite frequently. Let's talk about that. it's true that you don't want to just, I don't know, write a list of things that you've done, like in a CV, or to, I suppose, list very similar experiences. This might be something you want to avoid because it doesn't really tell whoever's reading it about you. And this is an important thing to keep in your head. If you didn't know yourself, which is a very impossible hypothetical in some respects, but if you didn't know yourself, what would you be telling yourself from reading this, about this person, about yourself? And I think it's the same for your universities. At Oxbridge, your tutors will read your personal statement. These are the people who will be teaching you potentially. And so it's important that you don't try and show off, I suppose, and embellish things. That's not what you should do. But it is important to really give some kind of concept of yourself. Now, how do we do that without going too far? Well, this answer here, the less personal, more achievement, is quite good. We don't always want to talk about just purely personal experiences. You're doing a law personal statement. It's not always the strongest thing to say. Since I was 4 and I fell off my bike, and because the pavement was broken, I've always wanted to be a lawyer in order to hold public authorities and local councils to account for their broken pavements. It doesn't really say that much about you because it's not a very unique experience. So we need to remember to balance our achievements with our personal feelings. And I think that's a very good thing to keep in mind. Now, we have another point over here on content. It talks about things mostly within their A-level. And again, with not enough focus on supercurricular. So, and even more with the talk more about supercurriculars. I think this is something that we need to bear in mind. So your grades and your A-levels will be submitted to your universities. They will know what you study. What distinguishes you as a student is not necessarily what you study in those A-levels, because everyone is studying those A-levels that's applying to your course, or the majority of them are. And if not studying the same subjects, they're studying similar subjects or other subjects which are graded. Talking about purely your A-level experience does not set you apart. Talking about things you've done outside sets you apart. Now, I can only really speak for law, but there are a few things that you might want to talk about generally. So for those of you who are interested in law, some supercurriculars you can discuss are things like going to a court hearing and viewing a court in the open section. You can talk about trying to get some legal work experience. It's very difficult to do, but there are work experiences that you can do online, open to all ages, on various websites for law firms or other things. Now, another thing you might want to do is, read a book that's not related to any of your A-levels. Show your independent desire to read something, and this can be something critical. And so for law, you might want to read a popular law book. There are a few that are listed online or on Oxbridge Mind, and it's good to keep those in mind. And I suppose for other humanities as well, something related to your subject that is not what you would do in school. So not just learning about a new topic, really thinking about engaging with the subject slightly differently. Maybe it would be, helping out at a history festival if you did history, doing something like reading some history commentary rather than just learning about a new area. These kind of things can be really helpful, and so can reading language books if you're doing the MLAT, books about languages rather than just what you studied in your languages. So the running theme here is that it's things outside of your usual experience that are important. If we scroll down, we look at again this comment on repetition. So it's not always a problem to repeat the structure you're using, but it is important that you don't repeat content. That's a big no. I mean, if you're repeating your content over and over again, what that's saying about you is that it's fairly one-dimensional. So what you want to do is you want to have a couple of experiences that you can draw on that aren't your usual academic experiences. And then you want a couple of academic experiences outside your subject. So this could be like reading a book or attending something academic. And the other experiences could be some sort of work experience or of relation to these things, perhaps attending open court or something like that if you do law, or some other history related opportunity if you do history, and the same applies for the other ones. So I think it's important that you do your research about these things. Okay, so here's a list of general things that you might want to remember. I think it's important, obviously, to remember the character limit, right? It's very hard to do this. You will go through many different drafts. You want to make sure that every word counts. That's true. So because it's a character limit, you want to make sure that every word you've said has meaning. Now, the danger with this is that you'll be tempted to write really extravagant words, quite over the top words that try and say more by saying less. And I think that that's problematic. So I think planning your personal statement is really, really important. I think meticulously planning it, what am I going to say here? How is this going to relate to my experience? These are very important things to help you not waste words. Give specific examples and go beyond the curriculum. Well, this relates to what we were just talking about. So I think remembering those two things, some extracurricular academic things and some maybe work-based or other things. And it doesn't have to be for very long. I personally shadowed a barrister. I just sent an email and I asked, can I come to your chambers and see your court hearing for 2 days? And I went along with them, and I wrote that down, and I spoke about my experience. Now, these things can seem expensive or hard, but a lot of the time people will be willing to help you. So I think the biggest lesson you can learn with any of these things is not to be afraid about asking someone. If you're polite and you're well-meaning, that's fine. There are lots of opportunities online too, so do your research. There are lots of schemes where people might want you to come along and help out, and this applies for all of the humanities subjects. So do try and get involved, and do try and look online. Okay, great. And then the last tip is a kind of checking tip, right? When you finish your personal statement, read it out loud. Does it read well? This is a great tip for anything, right? I mean, even essays. I've written essays during my degree that you read out loud and you think to yourself, well, I don't know how I've quite managed this, but I think it's a very crucial thing, because you need to not just read out loud, but you need to do another thing. You need to imagine that you are learning about yourself, as I said, and that can really highlight some of your attributes. Think about how you come across, and don't be too robotic about things. I think it's very easy to try and be very polished, but just represent yourself. Think about what you know, what you've done, and how that made you feel, and how that relates to what you're trying to say. Don't go any further than that. It's easy to come across too polished, and it's a bit of a concern. Okay, great. So I'm sure there's a lot of information right now, and we'll have a chance to talk about it in more detail at the end when we have a bit more of a focused question session. So we're on to a slightly different section now. This is about interviews, and I think this is like the super fun bit, in my opinion. So what do you know about interviews at Oxford and Cambridge? So the interview is designed to assess your academic potential. That's very true. Tutors are looking for your self-motivation and enthusiasm for your subject. And decisions are based on ability to think independently and to engage with new ideas. So this is, I think this is the crux of it, right? We discussed this yesterday a little bit, or I discussed it. And when I was talking about this, I mentioned, I'm sure some of you might remember, that it's really about testing your ability to be evaluative of yourself, to think about, where you might have gone wrong. And I think understanding where you could have gone wrong is the most important thing for interviews in general. So we'll go on to this in a little bit more detail in a second, but for now, these are the basics. So the Oxford interview is early to mid-December, and in Cambridge is at some point during December. It can vary for Cambridge. Now, in terms of what actually happens on your interview, well, you will go and you'll stay within the college that is interviewing you. They will give you a room and you will meet the students who will chaperone you, basically. They'll show you things, they'll show you around the college, and you might do a few events to get to know people. And this can last anywhere between 1 to sort of 5 days. I remember for my interview in Oxford, I went up on the Tuesday and I didn't come back until Friday evening, because the way that they do your interviews, they give you sometimes a day break between them. You might have room for other activities, and they might also be late making a decision about when your next interview is. So you really are at their mercy when you're up there, but it's a very fun experience, and it's really enriching. I made lots of my friends on my interview, and I've got lots of close friends who didn't attend university in Oxford, but were still close friends. So it's a really nice experience. We can talk more about this in a bit as well. So how can Oxbridge Mind help you? Well, this is a really good question, because it seems that for an interview, it's just based on, your own abilities, your natural abilities. But I think the most important thing for any interview is that you can practice. I remember practicing for my interview, and it's really crucial that you can get feedback from someone about how you're going wrong. It massively increases your chances. It's probably one of the most important things. Because the style of interview is very unique. Now, I think this is where I can talk a bit about my personal experience. So I do have experience of all of these interviews for humanities via my friends and some of my peers. And I think that if I just run through them quickly, it might be of use. So for law, you'll be asked to do 2 or 3 interviews, and these will have 2 completely different tasks involved. So the first interview will be on something, and the second interview will be on something else. They don't necessarily require you to know any law going into them. They might give you some law to look at yourself, but you do not need to have looked up any law beforehand. It can actually affect your performance if you have. For English, a lot of it is to do with poetry analysis and argument. So you might get given an unseen text in one interview, and then you discuss it. And then in your other interview, they might ask you about some theories, or they might ask you to talk about your interpretation of something that you've read. And I think that's very important, because the English interview, you might have to bring up something you've said in your personal statement. Now, for all of these interviews, it's important that you do go over your personal statement beforehand. This is very crucial. And these are kind of the suggestions that are offered by Oxbridge Mind, myself having been a interview tutor now for well over a year, and I've conducted many interviews, which I have to say is a very fun experience, because as I said yesterday, I'm not on the receiving end anymore, so it's quite nice to be a bit harsh. I'm only joking, but so it's something to think about. Having this interview practice is really crucial. It can give you some really key pointers, and you can also get a lot of experience from different tutors who have had very different experiences. And so I think it helps prepare you for the myriad of different interview approaches. Okay. So this again is similar to what we saw yesterday. The one-to-one tutoring is really crucial. So I've had a lot of experience with interviews myself, and also going forward in law professionally too. And I think that having a one-to-one interview service is really crucial. I remember very nervously and as crass as it is, quite sweaty walking into my interview, very panicked about how it was going to go. And the tutors will make you feel really relaxed. But without having some experience beforehand, I think I would have just crumbled. It's really, really difficult to imagine that kind of situation beforehand. It's a mix of excitement, about academic passion alongside, the mix of nerves. Meeting new people for the first time, it can be very nerve-wracking. I actually remember going into my first interview, and my then tutor and now quite good friend offered me a glass of water, and I did think it was a bit of a mind game. I was like, "What is this a game?" It obviously wasn't, but you read into these things, and so in that respect, it can be very nerve-wracking. If you think a glass of water is a mind game, then you're definitely nervous. So I think it's really good to have some prior experience in this respect. Now, it seems to me time-wise, we'll have a lot of time for questions. So the interview and personal statement, I think, are the juicier parts of the application process. Okay, and so we see another review, but again, as I said yesterday, personal testimony is really important. Not only is it a fun experience, but it is also really, really crucial that you do have some experience having an interview. And I remember my interview that I had, my mock interview that I had, was nowhere like my real interview, because the people who interviewed me didn't have any experience with Oxbridge interviews, with law interviews. So it can be very difficult, I think. So yeah, I think it's really, really important, how I've seen students develop their thinking for interviews in my own personal experience. Great. So we have the links here, and I think, it's important to check these things out. Interviews are one of the most mystical elements of the academic system around the world. The Oxbridge interview is probably one of the hardest, strangest tests that there exists for anything, for any qualification the world over. Not even in Ivy League schools in America do they have this kind of strange, very academically focused entry grilling. So I think it's a very important thing that you check these things over and have some practice before. So I'll leave these free resources up for the meantime before we go into a Q&A, but I'm expecting there'll be a lot of questions, or I'm hoping there'll be a lot of questions, is probably more accurate. So, okay. As I said yesterday, the YouTube channel is great for giving some insights into these things. There are some interview resources on the YouTube actually that are very useful. And as I said yesterday, the college comparison guide is there. Now, interviews do vary based on college. It's uncertain to say what the interviews are going to be. Every year they do change. I know some of my peers at other colleges had to do very different interviews to me, just in the way that they were laid out and the things they were asked to look at. So it is good to kind of get a spread of experience and read up on these things, definitely. And that is the home page. Great. So if there are any questions, please do ask away. We have a bit of time, about 25 minutes. So please do ask away. I have a couple of questions in the chat. So the first question is, would you advise talking about sports if you've done something notable within it, e.g. coaching, in addition to supercurriculars? Yeah, I would say that discussing sport is an important thing, because sport, it's not so much about the sports you've done, but so much about the skills you've learned from them. Now, I don't think that this is something you should prioritize in a personal statement. I think the way to structure a personal statement is focus more on your academics. But I think at the end, if you want to mention your sporting abilities, or you want to tie your sporting achievements into your supercurriculars, and maybe say, I've got a skill from this, and I improve this or develop this in my sport. It's definitely something you can do. So don't write it off immediately. It's about seeing where it would fit in. Okay. Are most interviews still online, or are they mainly in person now? I believe they're in person now. I can attest to this because I got kicked out of my accommodation in order to supply a room for an interviewee or an interview candidate. So they are in person. I'm not sure whether they are keeping them in person. They might go online, but in person is nice. You get to have a look around. I mean, I remember my first photograph I ever took of the room I stayed in, and it turned out to be my best friend's room. So it's a really nice thing to do, to go and meet these people and meet the students. Okay, so is it better to read a more obscure book you're interested in rather than a book everyone has read when it comes to law applications? I think go for a spread. My direct advice on this would be, read maybe a foundational book. One of the books that's mentioned quite a lot is The Rule of Law by Tom Bingham, Lord Bingham. It's a good book to read. It gives you a very good overview. But I think, if you read a more discursive book maybe that gives you some idea about the discussions, that's also good too. So reading a range of books would be important, but don't try and read something extra impressive because, horror story, it could actually have been written by the person who interviews you, or it can be really difficult to understand. I mean, I still don't understand the law really at my level after my degree, and I probably never will. It's not one of these things that you can ever really understand in a lot of respects. And it's the same with all academic subjects. The further you keep going, the more confusing it can be. So don't try and read something extra impressive. Try and read something that you will be able to talk about. I think it's very important that you remember with personal statements that everything you mention is something that you might have to talk about at some point. So don't mention anything you don't have a clue about. It's a bit risky. Okay. Should I mention achievements such as being head girl at school, even if it doesn't directly link to my course? And do they care about things such as gold DV? So this is a really good one, because with these things, it might seem like they are irrelevant. But I remember I ended up being a prefect in my school, and I ended up running a couple of clubs. And I mentioned these things later on in my personal statement after my academic interest to kind of show that I was trying to further this interest with other people. So I think these achievements are important to mention if you can link them to something. They're not just throwaways. And this comes back to not wasting any words. If you can talk about why these things might be relevant, why they might be important, that's really great. Don't lead with them. Lead with your academic experience or your academic interests and tie these things in afterwards. But they're not necessarily irrelevant. As I said before, if you feel you have space for it, keep it in there. And then also ask, will they expect any prior knowledge? The answer is no. Unless you're studying something like languages or classics or English, they might expect a bit of prior knowledge. If you've written something on your personal statement about knowing something, they might ask you about this. For law is very unique that it doesn't require any prior knowledge. And it's true that they don't require any prior knowledge sets to give you. You have to learn before you go up to interview, but you don't necessarily need any more knowledge than what you already know from your A-levels and what you already know from your personal statement. So keep it simple. Don't try and learn anything complicated about these topics. Just make sure you know your personal statement firstly, and secondly, that your A-level knowledge is fully secure. Because if you're doing languages, they might ask you about your language. The languages section does have a language exam in it. So, you need to know your language for this. Okay, great. If you were looking at history, would there be multiple interviews, and how might they differ? So there will be multiple interviews for every subject. You have more than one interview. If that wasn't clear, I'm sorry, but you do have more than one interview. Some people end up having 5 or 6 interviews because you might get interviewed at other colleges. So be prepared with your personal statement, that you know your personal statement well, you know what you said, and you have your knowledge in your head about your A levels, and that's all they can really ask for. That's all they can really ask for. So for history, there would be multiple interviews, and they might differ in what they ask you to do. So one might be about discussing something you've spoken about in your personal statement. They might ask you historical questions on this. The other one might be a source analysis. So very similar to the HAT aptitude test. How many books do you recommend reading? I think 3 is a pretty good rule. 2 or 3 is pretty good. 3 gives you a bit of discretion, so that if one of the books isn't really relevant when you come to write it, you have something else to talk about. It's good to be specific too. When you mention something in your personal statement, be specific about it. Don't just say you've read the book, but what about the book interested you? Do you know where I can look for advice on which books to read for theology? So if you're doing philosophy and theology, which is a cool degree, I think read around outside of your subject. If you have any more questions, I'm sure Oxbridge Mind will be very willing to supply an answer. But what I would say is, looking for theology books, look on an online forum, look on the Oxbridge Mind page to see what is being suggested. These are good suggestions. And then, looking up books or looking on the Amazon suggestions around these things can be really good. So yeah, please do have a look around too. Okay, hope that's helpful. So we have a lot of questions, and I will start from number 1. So, okay. Is there a speaking component in the interview if applying for languages? Yeah, I do believe there is. There's a language test component, so you do need to know your language. I'm not completely sure how it's running now, because things might have changed over COVID, and I can't remember what recent candidates have done. So I think, if you ask Oxbridge Mind a question or look on the internet, it's always a good solution. But I believe that there is some light speaking component. It's not massively crucial, but there is a language component that relies on your languages. So speaking is a part of that. Okay, how long does a personal statement take to write? Should we begin in the summer of year 12? Absolutely, you should begin in the summer of year 12. Oxbridge applications are due in late October. It's very, very stressful if you're entering year 13, new content, focusing on your exams more, and focusing on, I don't know, other events in your life that are important, to also be writing a personal statement. Over the summer, it might take a bit of a push, but I suggest that you do it over the summer. I think by the time you get onto summer, you should try and aim for 1 draft. It might be that your school runs a personal statement service. It's also useful to, maybe have someone check over a personal statement. It's something that I do all the time, both for Oxbridge applications and for other universities, and also, for jobs and so on. So yeah, I think as early as possible is good. Try and have an idea of what you're going to write, and try and get a few drafts in over the summer. 2 or 3 drafts is important so that it can be checked over. Okay, cool. Could you mention volunteering? Yeah, of course you can mention volunteering. That's a really good thing to mention. If you've done volunteering related to the subject, that's a great thing to mention, because it shows your academic interest, and it shows that, you're willing to be an active participant in this subject. So that's really good. If you can talk about how it's fostered your interest in something specific, that's a great thing to mention. How long does a personal statement take to write? Should we begin in the summer of year 12? Yeah, as I said, yes, you should. It doesn't necessarily take you very long to write, but you want to make sure that it's a really, really excellent document that you're submitting, that really represents you. So I think with that in mind, you need to give yourself as much time as is possible. Does attending a summer school count as supercurricular? Yeah, it does. I think if you've attended a summer school, it's worth mentioning that you've done that. It's important because it shows that you're interested outside of your degree, and also outside of your A-level subject. So it's a good thing to mention. Okay. Should I talk about how roles of responsibility in school, like head boy of house, in my personal statement? Yeah, I think if it gives you some relevant skill to being a student, it's an important thing to talk about. I think if you focus on the kind of underlying importances of this. Why is it a relevant thing to your personal statement? What are the skills you've learned? These are all important things to talk about. Tag them along if you can. Should you mention participation in Oxbridge outreach programs to your subject in your personal statement? I think it's a good thing to mention. If you participated actively in an outreach program and you've attended, it's not always something to lead with necessarily, but I think it's something that's worth mentioning. If you've done something active as a participant there, or you've attended these things, I think it's an important thing to kind of tag along again. Is it okay to provide a brief analogy example at the start to set up the personal statement? Yeah, I think it is. I think you want to avoid being, really super cliche in the sense that people might already have said this thing, but to provide an example of what interests you about your subject. I mean, these are top academics. They are some of the most influential people in academia and also in industry. You have to remember, one of our tutors is a Supreme Court judge now. A lot of my tutors would write memos and advices to top judges, so they have a real impact on things. They're really academically gifted and interested people, and they want you to join them. So I think it's really important that you try and say why you're interested. Providing a brief analogy or an example of what interests you about the subject or what you want to study taps into their passion. It's a really nice thing to read. And it's nice for any student who's really academically interested to read about these things too. So I think it's a great thing to do. How did I prepare for my interview? Well, I had mock interviews. That was important. And I made sure I knew everything that I'd said back to front. That was also important. Now, there are certain techniques that you practice, but thinking skills are good to practice. So if you can look up some general thinking skills, I think this was the hardest thing for me, but be reflective, consider that you could be wrong in an interview. That's important. So having some practice is crucial. Making sure you're self-aware and that you're not trying to fight, that you're really submitting yourself to the ideas. That's important. And then knowing what you said back to front, I think are the three important things to be aware of. So knowing everything you've written back to front, having some practice is crucial, and really, considering that you might need to change your mind is really important. If you study law at A-level, how much do you talk about what that has taught you? I think if you studied law at A-level, I think it's a good thing to maybe mention some of the interests, but I don't think that it's important to really stick with this. That's because law at A-level and law at degree level is very different. And I think that with law at A-level, you need to be careful that you're not just using or relying on what you've done in your curriculum to show how much you're interested. I think, it's the same as if you were studying English and you just spoke about your English experience, like that personal statement that we had seen. It's important that you get your extracurricular in. So by all means, talk about the skills, but I think mention it last. Don't mention it in terms of your main experience. Mention how you've developed these skills first and why they would make you a good student. Do you have a recommended structure for a personal statement? Yeah, I think it's not a very strict structure, but you need to remember a few different things. So the first thing is your opening, right? How are you going to introduce your passion, and how are you going to relate that and demonstrate that with academic and extracurricular experiences? Then I think that's the first kind of section. The second kind of section, which I think is so important, is to kind of tie in these experiences to why you want to study, this degree. You've come up with your opening, you've said how it's inspired you, but how does this relate to your degree? And then I think a third section is to focus on, why would you be a good student? And this goes for any personal statement. Why are you qualified to do this? And it's not about you saying, I'm really academically gifted, I'm this and that. It's about saying that you are committed and that you can work well. And I think that's really what it's about. So this third section about demonstrating your skills. This might be where you talk about your extracurricular sports or something else. To demonstrate these values is really important. So tie in your interests at the beginning, open up what interests you. How does that link to your experience? That's also important. What else have you done to demonstrate that you're a good student, that you're a good fit for this? And then maybe mention a couple of other things. So it's a loose 4 stages, but I hope that helps. So again, how did I prepare for my interview? Well, I've answered that, but just to go over it again, it was having a practice interview, having practice interviews, making sure I knew everything and practicing some thinking skills. These all sound very generic, but I think knowing your personal statement can only be your friend, right? In case you get asked on it. Having a practice interview can help prepare you and take some of those nerves away, but also give you a flavor of what might go on. And practice some thinking skills, these critical thinking skills. The things we spoke about yesterday about, looking online for them or looking in a book or a library or at school or on Oxbridge Mind can be really useful to help you recognize where you might be going wrong. And then, as I said, recognizing how you might be going wrong, accepting that you could be wrong on something is a really crucial thing to just help you push yourself a little bit further. So do you have any information about PPE interviews? Yeah, I do. So for PPE interviews, you will have a philosophy, a politics, or an economics kind of interview each. And the economics interview might ask you to do something mathematical. So it's important that you have some strong math skills. And then philosophy and politics, they will focus on a kind of more critical thinking based test. For philosophy, they might ask you to read something and pick the problems out of it. For politics, it might be something similar. It might be a current affairs piece and you need to talk about the context of it. So it's nothing that you need prior knowledge for apart from the math skills, but it's good to carry through your skills that you've learned from your A-levels or from college or from sixth form into these things, right? I think that's important. Go armed with your mind and arm that mind with knowledge about what you said. Arm it with knowledge that you've got from your A-levels. How have these helped me? What are my thinking skills I've developed? And then arm yourself with just some curiosity. And I think that will stand you in really good stead. If you study law at A-level, how much should you talk about what that's taught you? Well, we've previously discussed this, so I'll move on. Should you say specific things such as this taught me critical thinking, or just imply it by talking about experiences? So I think when you're talking about critical thinking or something like that, I think it's important to kind of say, well, how did it teach you this? Like maybe the commitment to this, or learning new ideas and being reflective taught me critical thinking skills, or having to analyze a complex problem. So I think you can be specific like this. I think implying things all of the time in a personal statement can be a bit of a waste of words, because it might not get your message across. It's very risky to either be too explicit or too implicit. So there's a fine middle ground, and that's a very vague statement, I know. So how do we get over the middle ground? Well, we use specific examples, that way we're being explicit, but we can draw the links between these things, and that way we can kind of get that nice implicit writing. Now, it's not always good to be too implicit, as I said. So it's a balance, but I think if you're going to panic about being implicit or being explicit, do decide to be explicit. I think it's very crucial that you can be implicit when you talk about why you're interested in something, what the academic drive is. But when you're talking about how your skills relate, you're going to need to be explicit. You don't want to take the risk of something being lost in translation. So I think it is a fine balance, firstly. And I think, being specific can help you strike that balance. But I think being explicit when you're relating skills is really important to helping you not waste words and not lose things in translation. How much is Oxbridge Mind's one-on-one interview tutoring? Now, I think it's something that you would have to take up with Oxbridge Mind, purely because there are a series of different packages and a lot of students will just want 1 or 2 interviews. So it can fluctuate a lot. I think if you send them a message, they'll be really responsive in getting back to you on this. Just because it can vary so much, it's really hard to come up with an exact figure. So I think send them a message. If that's a bit of a pain, look on the website, and it can really help you. There's always consultations they can give you for free, or even a brief piece of advice. And yeah, I think that's a good way to go about it. Okay, so you mentioned that the mock interview experience you had was very different to the real thing. So Oxford mine is more similar to the real ones. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the thing that makes it a lot more realistic is that it's people that sort of did the interviews 2 or 3 years ago, and also people that sort of speak to the people who are interviewing you. It sounds a bit trivial and surreal to say, but it just shows how academically knitted these environments are and how much they're looking to push your success. You might speak to your friend who's a tutor, and they say, "Oh, I've got an interview this afternoon," and you might ask them, "Oh, what did you put in the interview?" And you might have a joke, and they say, "Oh, that's it's an interesting thing," or you might say, "I don't know what I would have said if you'd asked me that." So these environments are really academically knitted together, and they really want to see you succeed. And so I think getting as close as you can to the real thing really helps you to kind of meet that need. But it's all about the passion. As long as you can demonstrate you're passionate, I think that will prevail in any interview experience that you have, whether or not it's accurate or otherwise. So I think it's a good thing to do, but again, there's absolutely no pressure. There's lots of resources. Okay, so what is the perfect balance between academic and supercurricular? I think they're not mutually exclusive. You can have academic activities that are supercurricular. It's not purely your A levels versus supercurricular. I think extracurricular activities or supercurricular activities can also be academic. So I think if you lead with the academic stuff, especially if it's academic and supercurricular, that will stand you in really good stead in showing that you've got passion and dimension outside of your A-level academic studies. So I think if you can focus on the intersection between the two of them, it's a really good thing to do. What are the admission tests like for different subjects? For an example, when do they take place? So this was covered yesterday. I'm sure if you reach out to Oxbridge Mind, they can send you an update or a screen, but essentially there are lots of different subjects. I don't have time to go through them all now, but I will say for those specific examples you've given, they take place in October. History will be organized through your school, and law you'll have to organize yourself. They are single exams. You don't sit more than one, you just go in and do the exam. History is focused on sources, and the law exam you can look up online and be on that website and it will tell you all about it. But essentially it's a multiple choice and then an essay based thing. Please have a read about it, because I don't have time to go through it now, unfortunately. And I want to make sure that you've got all the information. Okay, should summer schools be a main part in your personal statement? It's difficult to say you have a main part in your personal statement, because there's not a main thing you should mention. It's more so that you need to demonstrate your interest and why it's interesting you. And that's the main thing, not a particular factual situation you've been in. So if you can link your summer school to this interest, that might end up being within your main part. But I don't think you should focus on, just talking about a summer school straight off the bat. You need to relate it to your interest. Any advice on books I can read for psychology? A lot of my friends would kick me now for not remembering the books that they've complained to me about for many years. I can't actually remember any off the top of my head, but if you look online or on Oxbridge Mind, there'll be a list of resources and good books to read. What questions would generally be asked in a psychology interview, and what supercurriculars can be done for psychology? So the psychology, they might ask you something about research. They also might ask you about your personal statement, things you've spoken about, and they might ask you to do maybe like an ethics-based or evaluative task. You might also have to do something mathematical. All sciences at Oxbridge require you to do some statistics. So there is a mathematical-ish component, but it varies from subject to subject. I can't remember if psychology has one of these, but I do know you have to study statistics in psychology. So what supercurriculars? Well, I think it's a good thing to search online. I mean, off the top of my head, you could maybe ask if you could, I don't know, maybe interview someone or speak to someone about psychology, or, a psychologist. You can get involved and see if they have any volunteering schemes, these kind of things. Or you might want to, do an investigation. A good thing to do for these kind of subjects is something called a MOOC, which is a massive open online course. It's a lot of descriptive words there, but it's basically a course you can sign up to for free. It's like an investigative project on something. So type in MOOC, massive open online course, and see what they have to offer. That's also a good alternative. Okay, so what different types of admissions tests are there? Well, this is what we went through yesterday. Please contact Oxbridge Mind to see the list. But if you look online, there's also a list on there, both on the Oxbridge Mind website and also just on other pages. I plan to do a history and politics as a degree. Should I talk about them separately in my personal statement? So you're going to need to talk about both of them. It's very important to talk about both of them. Trying to link them together also might be important. So you might want to demonstrate your interest in both and then link them together. This might be good to have some advice for, but yeah, you should talk about them both in your personal statement. Are summer schools for Oxbridge unique, more important than other summer schools? I don't think it's that important. I didn't do any summer schools personally. Lots of my peers didn't do them. Some of my peers did. It's not necessarily the summer school that gives you the advantage. It is, in fact, how you can talk about these things. How many interviews are there, and are they different? It depends what for. I mean, for different subjects, there might be, 3 interviews, 4 interviews. For others, there might be 2. It depends on your college as well. So it can be very different. I suggest, looking at resources to see, what was my law interview like? Without talking about this all night, it was really interesting. That's the best way to summarize it. It was really, I think the best way to describe it is thrilling. And that sounds really weird, but it just captures the fact that I think going into it, you feel that for the first time, you're really engaging with some really detailed and direct academic inquiry. And I think that's really, really great. So, my interview was just thrilling, and they were all a little bit nerve-wracking, but that's part of it. But I think the best thing is that it's engaging and thrilling. You're speaking to people who really care about their subject more than anyone you might have met, and they also care that you care about their subject. So it's a really nice moment. If you're interested in what you're doing, it's a really great moment. What kind of questions do they tend to ask in an interview? It could be anything. It could be personal statement related. It depends on what subject you're studying. It's a good thing to look at previous questions, maybe ask some other people what they've studied and look on forums. There are some examples on Oxbridge Mind that are really good and quite accurate. So I suggest looking there too. Is it worth including any content of the course in my personal statement? It may be notable if most others will have covered it. It might be worth mentioning if you've got some sort of perspective on it or it's taught you something. I think it's definitely worth mentioning. I think if it's something people will have covered by virtue of the fact that they do a similar A-level to you and it comes up in your A-level, then maybe don't mention this. For example, I did my EPQ on something that was related to one of the courses that came up, and I wasn't asked about it because they don't tend to ask about law personal statements, but it was also something that I think looks quite nice. It looks like you're interested. So yeah, I think if you include some content that you think will be relevant and you can talk about why it's important or why it's furthered your interest, and you know it's related to the course outside of your A-levels, then I think it might be worth mentioning. Can I mention being a subject scholar in my personal statement? Yeah, absolutely. If you are a subject scholar and you're in something at school, do mention it, tag it along and say, as a subject scholar too, this has taught me, etc. Talk about your dedication and how you've become that subject scholar. I think that demonstrates good studious qualities. can use a quote, i.e. from a book or a philosopher. Yeah, you can. I wouldn't always advise it because it can come across a bit cliche. And you have to think, can I defend what I've said in my personal statement? As I said earlier, can I back up what I've said in my personal statement? That's really important. And if you get asked, which philosopher said this, what page was it on, and what were they referring to, it can be a little bit of a sticky situation. So a quote can be useful sometimes, but for two reasons: it can be cliche and it can catch you out. I think avoid it if you can. What do you mean by thinking skills? So that's a really great question. Now, thinking skills are just these critical thinking skills we referenced yesterday, recognizing an assumption, thinking about information, not taking it as accepted or given. These kind of skills that you often do in your A-levels. I think if you look up thinking skills or critical thinking skills, you'll get a good picture of these things. And I think it's just about recognizing the skills you use in your A-levels when writing an essay or coming to a conclusion that you can apply here. So I think look up online for a comprehensive list. But yeah, it's these kind of skills, the skills that you employ when you think about information, when you process information. Do you know what kind of questions are asked in AI interviews? I'm not sure what AI is referencing. So I can't really provide an answer. If you have a way of clarifying that quickly, please do drop a question in. Okay, so any advice for economics person statement interview? Yeah, just talk about your economic experience. And that what that means is not your personal financial situation so much, but talk about what interests you about economics. It's very important to kind of have an interested area, read some books on it, and have a look at these things. For the interview, it will be mathematically based. Now, if you're doing PPE or economics and management, these are the kind of mathematical elements. So I think brush up on your math skills. Try and, if you do economics A-level, remember some of the equations that from this. And just remember to be, reflective, as I said. Think about where you might have gone wrong. If you do go wrong, it's not the end of the world. Could you mention initiatives you started? So in terms of initiatives I've started, I think it's an important thing that you could mention, right? So if it's coming from your personal perspective, and I'm looking at my own experience, I mentioned a few initiatives I'd started. I set up a law society at school. I set up, a legal debate society, and some other things. So I think if you started an initiative, it's a really great thing to mention. It's a really great thing to mention. In an interview for artificial intelligence or computer science course. Now, I don't particularly know what you could be asked for AI or computer science. I do know I have quite a few computer scientist peers and friends. They not only get asked mathematical things, but you might get asked some more philosophical questions about AI or computer science, particularly things about singularity or the way to regulate or constrict AI, or what are the core principles within AI. Okay, great. Is there anything we should avoid mentioning in our personal statements? Don't mention anything that you wouldn't be able to talk about and you wouldn't be able to back up with facts. In your personal statement, it's important that if you make a claim about the way something has made you feel, or has encouraged you, or has inspired you, or the way that you think something is, you need to give some supporting evidence. So don't mention anything that you're not going to give supporting evidence, or you couldn't back up if asked about it. I think it's important to avoid mentioning some things, as we said. It's not a hard and fast rule, but your A-levels are maybe something you want to try and diminish maybe a little bit. I think mentioning really personal experience can work against you sometimes, especially if there's nothing to back this up. So if you're going to mention something emotional or something that was important in your development, if you can back it up and demonstrate how that's really pushed you forward, that's a good thing to do. But I wouldn't advise just mentioning claims you can't back up, claims that don't have any backing, or things that you're and very deeply personal that maybe don't seem relevant. So it's really about you judging it. What's a reasonable, interested thing to say? What kind of questions are asked in a physics interview? Now, this is the humanities segment. In a physics interview, it is split between some general interview practice, which will be non-mathematical, and then some mathematical problem-based stuff. So you will have to focus on doing mathematical equations and answering problem questions with your tutors. That's what they'll do. So for a lot of science-based things, it will be problem questions. They'll give you a problem to solve, and you have to use maths and physics to solve it. So that gives you a bit of a flavor, but it's not enough, I know. So please contact Oxbridge Mind, have a look on their website, and they will give you some more information, or just look it up yourself. Could you mention a podcast rather than a book you've read? I think it might be a good thing to do. But I think with podcasts, it can be very difficult to really show that same level of effort, because with a podcast, it's very easy to listen to. It's very accessible. So I think a podcast might be something you could mention, maybe to kind of give even more supporting evidence, and as a result of reading this book, I explored it on this podcast, but I wouldn't necessarily lead with a podcast. Mr. Subject test slides from yesterday. Can I view it anywhere, or what were the key points for the TSA and hat? So you can access the live stream if you contact Oxbridge Mind. They should send you a copy of the live stream from yesterday. Apologies if I'm giving them loads of work to do. To my colleagues, I am sorry. But in terms of the TSA and the hat, the TSA is a bit more complicated, so you might have to look that up yourself. But the hat is just your school, you book it, you need to get in contact with them and say that you want to sit in, and it will be a source-based history skills component. Could you talk about specific people you've met related to the field? Yeah, you could do. If you've organized a meeting with someone or you've interviewed them, it might be something to do. Just be wary of doing this, because, it could be one of your tutor's colleagues. I know that a lot of high-profile professors, experts, etc., are visitors of the university or lecture in some respect, or are, stipended professors, which means they work as tutors, or they might be fellows of your college or another one. So, be very careful. If you're going to mention them, don't misrepresent their ideas. Be very truthful about what was said. It's good. It's a good thing to support that. Say you're very interested, you wanted to explore something more. You went to a conference and you met this person, and they said something. That's a good thing to do. If you went to a talk to evidence your interest, also a good thing to do. So please try and relate this to some of your academic interest. But if you're going to mention these people, be accurate, be polite, and don't misrepresent what they've said, because these might be either the people who interview you, which would be an absolute horror. I don't know if that has happened before to someone I know. They mentioned some work that they did and the person interviewed them. So it was a little bit awkward in some respects, but it could be fun. So make sure you link it and make sure you're accurate. And I've got two final questions to look at in the chat. No, I don't actually. Yeah, books on theology. So as I said, look online. Okay, great. So apart from that, thank you everyone for attending. It's been great to see a lot of familiar names back. And it was good to see a lot of you active yesterday. So yeah, as I said, thank you. I hope this has been useful. And if you have any last minute questions, quickly, manically type. If not, have a good a weekend. Try and get some rest. Try and remember some of these lessons. It's not always essential. And if you have any further questions, Oxford Mind can help. There are resources online. Good luck with this. And I wish all of you the best. These are great institutions, and they really want you to be there too. Okay. Fantastic. All right. Well, as I said, good luck with everything.